Welcome back to the Plenary Session 6 of IMA's Global Procurement Summit on one of the most interesting themes, challenges and opportunities for health commodities procurement and distribution, particularly COVID-19 vaccines. Let's welcome on the digital dais the session chair, Mr. Jeff Taylor, Director Procurement Division, Asian Development Bank, Manila. Hi, Jeff. We also welcome our speakers, Mr. Vinod G. Pillai, Vice President Sourcing, HLL Lifecare Limited, India, Ms. Anna Pinto Hebert, Senior Operations Officer, Preventive Services, World Bank, Washington, D.C., Mr. Steve Guppy, Director of Procurement, Crown Agents, UK, and Professor Prashant Yadav, Center for Global Development, Washington, D.C. Welcome, distinguished panel. With this, I hand over the session to the session chair, Mr. Jeff Taylor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, evening, or morning, or just plain hello, everybody, wherever you may be found. Thank you very much for attending this session. I'll just give a general overview of where ADB fits in the big picture, and then leave it to the experts really to talk about the procurement transactions and challenges and so forth that we're seeing being faced by our clients, that we're trying to help them overcome, understand and overcome, and what we think the challenges are ahead. ADB recognized fairly quickly the potential severity of COVID-19, and worked early on a large assistance package of $20 billion for ADB's developing member countries, DMCs. Most of that is now fully committed. A lot of it has been budgetary support, but equally a large portion, about 40% or so, was directed towards PPE. And I'm sure Steve, Prashant and Vinod can add on the challenges of procuring PPE. ADB, of course, is a bank. We don't do much real work, we lend money. But we did take on a small portion, $30 million or so, of PPE direct procurement using trust funds, which was by and large successful. From May through to September, we were able to procure and deliver $30 million of PPE through the trust funds that we were implementing. But the majority of the heavy lifting and the hard work occurs in ADB's loans, and those are by far the bigger sum. As I say, we had $20 billion available for lending, of new lending. It wasn't robbing Peter to pay Paul. This was additional financing. We brought forward some of our market capital and actually made it available in addition to our regular operations. And in December, we also approved an additional $9 billion with a specific target of procuring vaccines or financing the procurement of vaccines. And that will probably be split, or will be split, between rapid dispersing components, such as through the COVAX facility, such as contracts that have already been pre-negotiated by ADB's clients and borrowers. And then investment components such as cold chain, storage, distribution systems, tracking systems, and so forth. One of the things that it strikes me, and I'm sure our eminent panelists will be able to expand more on this, the first phase of PPE and protection is relatively straightforward. The second stage of vaccination, what is an eligible vaccine, and so forth, is far more complex than the first stage. One of the things we found in PPE procurement was that the market responded fairly quickly, or very quickly, to be honest, to the very high demands placed on it. And the pricing went up 300%, 400%, 500% very quickly through March, April, May. But it plateaued out and started to go down through September, October. Obviously, there's still scarcity in certain areas. Latex was an issue because of the production processes involved around it and scaling that up. But the masks and other forms of PPE normalized fairly quickly. We didn't identify significant opportunism, particularly. There was in pricing. I won't go as far as to say gouging, but there was in pricing in the early days. But every single supplier that we're aware of, with one exception, were demanding advance payments. Normally they would provide payment securities and so forth against those. Not in every case, but every single supplier we contracted with or oversaw ended up delivering the goods. There were some issues with inspection, some returns, and those goods were replaced under warranty conditions and so forth. And that, I think, is a fairly straightforward and simple, although on a global scale, a massive scale. When we contrast that with vaccine procurement. And now at the moment, what we're struggling with is what is an eligible vaccine? What should we be financing? What should our client countries be buying? And they're struggling with that as well. As we know, there are a few vaccines already in the market. And the test that we're applying in ADB is, has it been approved by a stringent regulatory authority? Or does it have World Health Organization pre-qualification? And the World Bank is taking a fairly similar approach, not identical, but fairly similar, as to what is an eligible vaccine. But within all of that, of course, we have our country's own systems and our country's own regulatory systems, which quite rightly regulate the medicines that are available within that country. So how does that fit in with the Philippines or Pakistan or India or Bhutan or Kazakhstan? Not perfectly is the answer. So we also have to be cognizant and aware of local regulation or national level regulation and legislation around the registration of drugs for dissemination in that market. And we're working very closely with our borrowers on this as well. And we expect to have to take a much more hands-on approach to procurement than we would do necessarily if it's a wastewater treatment plant or if it's a road or an MRT, where we're often at a distance. Because we within ADB are looking at this across 27 countries. And we do have the benefit of learning from the experiences of those countries. And another issue that we're facing is the vaccine manufacturers. And as we have seen in the EU, as we have seen in the UK, as we have seen in Canada, as we have seen in the US, they are de-risking the supply of vaccines from their side. We're seeing, for example, in the US and the UK, that the government is going to, or public funding is going to pick up and cover the liabilities that would normally be borne by a pharmaceutical manufacturer for the efficacy and the side effects of the drugs. And we understand the reasoning for that from the pharmaceutical companies is that normally a vaccine would be 10 years in development before it hits the market large scale, and they want to be indemnified against those risks in return for hitting that market early, which is obviously a huge public good provided that the vaccine is effective and safe. So that's one issue. We are seeing a lot of reluctance from vaccine manufacturers to give away full transparency over their contracting and what they're doing. And that's an issue for us as a public, from a public procurement perspective, because normally we will demand very high levels of transparency. But the vaccine manufacturers, as has been seen in the EU, has been seen in Canada, US and UK, are requiring anyone buying a vaccine to sign non-disclosure agreements and including confidentiality clauses in their contract. So that's something we're going to have to face as we go forward in the public procurement sector, is what can we put in the public domain? Ideally, it would be everything, all of the information, but the challenge is manufacturers are unwilling to do that or agree to that. So that's an issue we're going to have to face. I note that I think the Belgian finance minister leaked the COVID vaccine prices charged to Belgium, but then there was a swift retraction and then a statement saying that that wasn't the full price. So that's going to be a challenge, and getting visibility on what actually represents value for money in vaccine procurement. The different offerings require different technology, require different raw ingredients, require different manufacturing processes, require different logistical chains to both produce and then ship and then deliver and administer. So that all has an impact upon price. So how are you going to represent value for money in a public procurement context of $5 a dose versus $15 a dose? And some of that, I think, will come down to, for us, fitness of purpose. For example, if a super cold chain was required to deliver a very cheap vaccine, well, that's only any good when you have a cold chain that can support it. If you don't, that's bad value for money. So it's going to have to be looked at in its entire context over to what represents best value. But right now, the challenge for us with vaccine procurement, and we're talking on a weekly basis, more than that quite often with World Bank and their experience as well, is actually the availability of vaccines. You know, you're seeing the early movers gain early mover advantage, UK being an example, Canada being another, Indonesia another, that bought in bulk the active ingredient of Chinese vaccines for integration and distribution within the Indonesian market. So there has been significant advantage for the countries that were able to move early. Some of our clients have, some of our clients haven't. And that's going to lead to an inequitable or unbalanced distribution of vaccines, because the early movers will get the vaccines before the late movers. And that's why we think the COVAX facility is very, very important within this overall context. And we're also working closely with UNICEF to understand how COVAX is going to function, when vaccines will start becoming available, at least for the highest priority members of the populations within ADB's DMCs, and certainly globally as well. It's looking like early doors, 3 or 4% may get covered in the relatively short term from the COVAX facility, but we're waiting to hear more on that from UNICEF as they're evaluating the tenders. I think there was good news on the tenders, at least. There were 16 or 17 tenders received by UNICEF. How many will be actually good candidate vaccines, we'll see. We're also aware through our network of a number of manufacturers in dialogue with WHO on getting WHO pre-qualification for their vaccines, which again is good news because it will open up or broaden the market, and the more viable and effective vaccines that are in the market, the better the procurement outcomes will be. I think I've spoken enough from my side for now. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Vinod, the Vice President of HLL Lifecare Limited in India, to give you some of his hands-on experience and insight into the challenges being faced and how they're being overcome. Over to you, Vinod.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, okay. HLL was, there is a presentation, of course, you know, it may be a bit boring, maybe going through the presentation and repeating what it says there. But what HLL was entrusted with the task or nominated as a procurement agency for the COVID emergency procurement for the government of India. It was through the Health and Family Welfare Ministry. And we were tasked to procure 1.7 crores worth of PPE kits. And in addition, about 1.1 crores worth of N95 masks. But that point of time, this was the first, I think, maybe an experience for procurement of these PPE kits and masks. So the specifications, what was initially mandated was a type 3 type of a protective coverall, which is was not available at that point in good quantities. The initial requirement itself was for about 50,000 coveralls. But what we could procure, because by that time, whatever materials for COVID prevention was available in India were taken out to other countries. A lot of people were coming in and paying, you know, cash dollars and taking these kits and coveralls and all other marks everywhere. So there was a huge shortage of the material at that point of time. That is when the Ministry of Textiles and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare stepped in. They developed a new specification for the coveralls, which could be manufactured in India in consultation with the various prospective coverall manufacturers, and they came out with a standard specification for the coveralls. Somewhere, this requirement, initial requirement 50,000 itself came for somewhere in the first week of February or end of January. But there, as I told you, against a requirement of 50,000 itself, we could get maximum about 21,000 coveralls is what we could get. Mask, again, there was a production constraint with regard to the three manufacturers who were manufacturing masks as per the mandated specification of the ministry, what I had specified. So there also there was a production constraint. Second was that the transportation part was also a major hurdle, if you look at it, because these mask manufacturers are basically based out of Bombay. So their production schedule was not up to date. So because of which there was a huge shortage for that also. So whatever we could get, we brought in the initial phases, and that is when the Ministry of Textiles and Ministry of Health stepped in with regard to the coverall part in bringing a new specification where Indian manufacturers could manufacture these coveralls. And initially, it was stipulated that it has to pass the synthetic blood penetration test, which was a specific requirement at the seams as well as at the fabric level. And whoever passed the test, we were placing orders literally on the same day. There was not even a delay of a day from the receipt of the test report to the placement of the order. So, and during the COVID times, where there was a restriction movement, it was a hell of a task, managing the manpower deployments, getting all the people here to see that this goes on smoothly without any interruption, and the objectives are met. So, major problem what was faced initially was a scarcity. Next is there was no manufacturers at some point of time, or limited manufacturers. Third was that it was seller's market, as Mr. Jeff said. The price was, what they were asking was ridiculous. Even for I'm just coming out of this COVID emergency procurement, one component, 3-ply mask. 3-ply masks were available at about 1.5 to 2 rupees per mask. Were going at about nearly 20 to 25 rupees per mask. Similarly, if you look at the PP coverall part also, we could get a very inflated price because there was a huge shortage of fabrics. The manufacturers were not fully equipped with to manufacture these coveralls as per the specification. They had to import a lot of equipments from abroad to see that the sealing machines are brought. So all these difficulties were there. So initially it took about nearly a month for the supplies to fully take off. In spite of that, the problem was that the movement was the biggest problem. Second was that these manufacturers spread across India. So we had to set up a logistical infrastructure in place, wherein we had depots nearly across north, south, east, west, including Bangalore, Chennai, and other major location metros, so that these manufacturers can supply to the lowest or nearest point. Because of the transportation issues which are there, mainly restrictions in getting a transporter to transport the materials. Second is movement of these transport vehicles were also a problem. So we had to issue passes for each and every truck which was moving, stating that this is an emergency material which is moving, hence they may be allowed to go through and deliver the materials. So all these hurdles had put a lot of hurdles in the initial procurement stages. Because of which the offtake or the requirements what were coming in was not consummate to the actual ground requirements which were there in the health sector. But slowly the scenario changed. The people started having a systematic way of production and started supplying the goods. So there was a due improvement somewhere in April, May, June. We had good improvement in the supplies of the various products, mainly the PP kits, as Mr. Jeff said. Of course, then we also came into play in procuring ventilators. Ventilators also a product which was mainly imported, but there were a few companies who had come forward to supply the ventilators as per the specification of the Ministry of Health and Health and Family Welfare. and these ventilators were tested online on patients as a standby ventilator in hospitals to prove their efficacy and their operational efficiency, based on which the approvals were given for the specification part, and these ventilators were procured based on those parameters which passed the requirement. So these are a couple of things which we had procured. Of course, if you take each component, now when it comes to, let us say, mask, as I said, post development or post June, you will see that government also started asking all the suppliers to register in themselves in BIS, or mask manufacturers to register in BIS. This was mainly because they wanted a standardization of the specification and product. Similarly, even for coveralls, post June, they asked all the manufacturers who are presently at that point of time just getting the product tested at some Ministry of Textile approved lab to proceed with getting themselves registered in BS, so that there could be a standardization of the product as well as the specification part. Third part is goggles. Goggles also, if you look at it, there are only two manufacturers, basically some two manufacturers in India who are manufacturing these goggles. So we had to rely on importers to get the goggles which were required in bulk based on the requirement. Fortunately enough, there were people who came forward to supply those goggles as per the mandate specification, and we were able to get these products also. And last but not the least, as Mr. Jeff said, there was an insistence for nitrile gloves or not latex gloves. So we had to, this latex nitrile gloves, there is only one manufacturer in India. And he is only an export oriented unit. So his capacity was basically related to the export requirements. So those products also were imported to India, and from importers and resellers and traders, we were able to get these gloves, nitrile gloves. There was also a specific requirement for the length of the gloves. Usually, there are two sizes for gloves, nitrile gloves, if you look at it. One is 280 mm and one is 240 mm. But the requirement initially was for 280 mm, which was also again in short supply. So there came a point we had to get material from whoever had the material available with them. It was not like you had a choice. Okay, we will go as per what are the pricing which is available, or we will go as per this specificational criteria only. So there was some flexibility with regard to the pricing as well as the terms which are there. Like Mr. Jeff said, a lot of cases we had to pay amount in advance. But luckily enough, the supplies were completed against advance paid without any security again. There was no security also at that point of time. Because of the lockdown, a lot of banks were also closed. So getting a security at that point of time was also very difficult. So based on which we gave advances without, some few parties we gave advances without security, but the supplies were completed against those advanced parties. Second is that the payment what we agreed with all the suppliers in order to encourage them was we will make the payment within 5 days from the date of receipt of the materials. This was an incentive for them to supply faster. Because of which a lot of companies gave more emphasis on the quantity and may have slightly overlooked the part of the quality. So we also went in for a third-party inspection of all the coveralls, and only after pre-dispatch inspection the materials were accepted by us, thereby ensuring the quality of the coveralls. So these are the main factors which had put a lot of constraints, as well as it was a learning exercise for us. We learned a lot in this process. We learned how to work within timelines without any dimmer, which was also a great thing, because getting people to work, even though there is 100% lockdown with no movement of vehicles, no movement of people, and no other people available in the office itself, getting them all together and getting them to work was a very, very strenuous and great effort by all the team members, because of which we were able to do the job what was entrusted to us to the good satisfaction of the ministry. So what I would like to go, what is the advantage with regard to all these procurements happening? Now, in India presently, if you look at it, we have now post June, we are second largest supplier of PPE kits in the world. Average daily capacity for production of coveralls is 500,000. That's one of the major advantages which has happened. Second is that nearly 1,169 manufacturers or suppliers of coveralls are registered in GEM. And for N95 FFP2 masks, if you look at it, there are 344 manufacturers registered in GEM. And also there are, not sorry, for masks is 4,623 and goggles is 344 manufacturers. So you can see what it was somewhere in April, May, and what it is today. It is a quantum jump in the capacity, Indian, inbuilt capacity in India with regard to the PP coverall part. Similarly, if you look at it, a lot of these, as I told earlier, a lot of these manufacturers are migrated to BIS, and in GEM, there are about 24 manufacturers of coveralls, coverall manufacturers who are registered, we also got BIS license. Similarly, there are about nearly 150 manufacturers of N95 masks, which are also registered in GEM. Because as a government entity, there is a mandation to nearly full extent possible to procure from GEM. So now a lot of these entities, other than the government of India, are procuring through GEM for their PPE kits requirements. This has built up the capacity in India because of the efforts mainly, if you see why this specificational change, why this effort, if you look at it, major part has been played by the Ministry of Textiles and Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Because of this, such an explosive manufacturers have come forward in this particular field. And that point of time, there was no exports. So a lot of garment companies which were idling also, diverted their production to these areas, because of which this particular thing happened. I think this is what I would like to add to this particular incident. Also, we had also procured pharma products, mainly hydrochloroquine and azithromycin tablets for the ministry. Also, handheld thermometers which were procured for the Delhi airport on behalf of the ministry. These are the products mainly which was procured, and if you look at it in the span of, we have completed the supplies, and the government of India has told us not to procure any more materials. So with that, we have completed all the supplies to the government, and now we are in the process of reconciling and squaring off the total quantities as well as the payments and other things with the government as well as with the suppliers. This is what I would like to add. I would like to thank IMA and all the Mr. Jeff for giving us this opportunity, and the other functionaries of IMA for having given this opportunity for me to participate in this particular forum. And I also would like to express my gratitude to my team who had made this particular difficult task possible with their efforts and hard work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vinod. I've got a couple of follow-up questions after an excellent presentation. What do you think you would do with hindsight to better prepare for such a shock like this in the future? Would be the first question.
See, I think one of the major things what I found was lacking at the initial stages was we were dependent on an imported specification. If we had at that point of time, see, the process of developing an internal specification and understanding that some of the manufacturers can manufacture as per the specification took a bit of time. For example, if you see, the requirement came up somewhere in end January, beginning of February. Whereas these people or coverall manufacturers, they came into the limelight or orders placement started only somewhere in March first week or second week. So 1.5 months it took for the various agencies to come to an understanding on what could be the fabrics which could be used, and what could be the specification would be required to take care so that the persons or health workers and doctors and other persons wearing it are protected from any infection getting through to them. I think that was a major point. Second is that if you look at, see, we should also understand what is the capacity of the particular country. Now, even today, if you look at it, You said latex gloves, maybe a couple of manufacturers are there, but even today, latex gloves is in short supply across India. You cannot get latex gloves also easily. Then the requirement was nitrile gloves. As I said, there is only one manufacturer in India who manufactures nitrile gloves. So I think these particular looking at a far-reaching vision and projection, what could be the things which would come ahead if we take at least part of that into consideration and develop our infrastructure accordingly? I think that could be the best bet.
Okay, and do you think managed inventories would be part of the solution as well? I mean, bearing in mind many of these items have relatively short shelf lives, but do you think a managed inventory would be part of a response in the future?
Managing inventory, see, the thing is, the coveralls which are manufactured even as per BAS has got nearly about two and odd years shelf life is there, subject to it being stored in a proper temperature condition. Masks also similarly, they have also got a shelf life or something like that. Of course, managing a buffer inventory, it is always good. Now, even in the case of COVID, if you look at it, there could be any spike at any point of time. So maintaining a inventory and keeping it as a buffer is always there, which even the government of India took to that. They gave us an initial quantity and they gave us a buffer quantity, so that
Okay.
they had something in buffer with them. If at all any cases spiked or any contingency happened, they could use that buffer quantity, whatever was being procured by them.
Okay, a couple of questions personally from myself. I know GEMS and I know the EGB system reasonably well in India. Much of ADB's financing is channeled through it. How big a benefit or boon do you think having a well-functioning e-procurement system is in responding to COVID, not just PPE, but across multi-sectors? How important was procurement to the continued commerce?
Jeff, any procurement system which is through through electronic process should be flexible to take care of your needs. That is what I feel. It's my personal opinion. I feel that GEM needs to go a bit more in that particular direction. One. Second thing, just a minute. Second thing is that, see, there is no, what do you call it, no penalty or anything like that for default in supplies. Let us say I place an order on a party. If he doesn't supply, there is no, I lose. If there's something urgently required and I go through GEM and I place an order and the party, whatever be the reasons he does not supply, I lose that time, which is a very precious in such cases. So that is why we did not go through that process at all for throughout the MNC procurement, whatever we did. So it was all on whoever had the material, we brought it from them. It may be on maybe even in some cases it was on differential pricing, because what was available was what to be brought and at the earliest possible time, considering that each and every day was critical in saving lives. Third point is that the flexibility with regard to GEM also, it is a question to be noted, because see, you cannot have a quality inspection. Of course, inspections are there for quality before you procure any material, but that is a rigorous procedure, and getting these products gone through the pre-dispatch or whatever inspections and getting it at some point of time, there could be a lot of time lapses which could happen because of that.
Okay. I have a quick question from IMA staff over here, and it's something we've experienced in LD. In ADB, did you have normal contract clauses, liquidated damages and warranties, and were suppliers willing to accept those, or did you have to forego those as a purchaser?
Mr. Jeff, this was a time when we wanted people to supply to us. It was not a time when we wanted hindrances in people coming to us and supplying the material. So there was no LD clauses which were put in place. It was, if you put LD clauses, people will be skeptical. Now let us come to coveralls. It was a new product which has come into the Indian market or by India, and they had to source the raw materials, they had to source the sealing tapes, they had to source the machines. So when a new product is being developed or new product is being made in India, naturally there could be some delays with regard to the supply. So what is the time you could give to a person to supply? And then what is the extension you can give, because this is a process which is being followed maybe for the first time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Vinod. An excellent presentation and some very insightful and interesting responses to the questions that were thrown our way. I would now like to introduce our colleague from the World Bank, Anna Pinto Hebert, Senior Operations Officer, Preventive Services Integrity of the World Bank, Washington, D.C. And also thank Anna, because I know the time in Washington, for getting up so very early to be with us. Thank you very much, Anna. And over to you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I was a tad bit late. I had to restart my computer. Thank you. I'm sorry I was late to the excellent presentation before me. It's a very interesting story. I'll just go through a presentation really quickly, and I'll be happy to answer questions after. Let me know if at any point whether or not you will have problems seeing my screen. Um, um, one second, please. Is this visible to you? Hello?
Yes, it is, Anna. Emergency-related procurement.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So basically, from our experience, right? So the pandemic started in January, and we went into lockdown ourselves in sometime around March. And so we had to draw on our previous experiences with how to deal with emergency related procurement. So in the case of India, before I start, I wanted to first bring up what's been going on as far as corruption perceptions are concerned. So TI recently released its report and findings concerning corruption perceptions around the world. And in India, it found that the 2020 score was 40 out of 100, which means that this score puts India at the 86th rank among 180 countries. So somewhere in the middle. That seems to indicate a kind of slippage in terms of the score and rankings. But I wanted to focus on a second report attached to the TI report, which was the corruption barometer in particular. And here it's interesting that what TI found was in India, 89% of people think that government corruption is a big problem. And that of the people that were interviewed, 39% of them in accessing public services, including health services, had to pay a bribe in order to access those services over the past 12 months. So, meaning to say, at least within the range of 2020. So, this is the context within which emergency procurement would occur in India. So, definitely in terms of our experience in the context of emergency operations, weak oversight, inadequate controls, and the possible influence of private agents acting on behalf of outside parties can lead to broader problems in the provision of services and procurement of medical supplies that meet the important technical specifications, right? And so at the same time, in various health sectors around the world, there can be a situation where the sector is susceptible to risks of irregularities, including collusion and fraud. So, primarily due to weak internal controls and limited accountability. So, even in countries, though, with high TI scores, there have been problems that we have seen, or anybody would see if you were monitoring global reports. So in the case of one country which had high TA scores, um, there are a couple of examples I wanted to draw. So there was one situation where there was a medical supply company which had been not well run. It was making losses year in and year out. And it was run by a local government official on the side and received contracts under the pandemic program of that country in excess of the equivalent of $370 million to supply PPE. In that same country, there was a family investment firm that specialized in currency trading, etc. So there's definitely no experience at all in terms of providing medical equipment, and yet was given a $346 million equivalent contract to provide face masks. And when these face masks were delivered, 50 million of those masks were never used because they were inadequate to the task. So definitely a big waste. Now, we should note here that all these contracts were awarded using emergency provisions without any competitive tendering, because, as in many countries, competitive tendering for this particular program was suspended. And so agencies, both local as well as national, were given the green light to make quote unquote direct awards to firms. And there was little accountability about the way these decisions were made. So, in that country, in the 5 months until September, the main ministry that was coordinating the pandemic response had signed the equivalent of $15 billion. And although in that country there is a requirement for public procurement to be published at least 30 days within signing, it took an average of 10 weeks after being signed that some of these contracts were published. And as of December 2020, $4 billion worth of contracts were still not made public as of December. So what this tells us is emergency procurement really brings about a lot of issues when the national health systems have complexity and fragmentation. And definitely there is asymmetry of information. And so what this means is contracts can be given to unqualified firms if these firms are friends or have linkages to those who are able to issue contracts. And there's a lack of transparency when these things occur. There is also uncertainty, as we hear from the previous speaker. Now, what's bothersome here is that there's a lot of money involved, which needs to be dispersed in a short amount of time. And so this attracts a lot of fraudsters. And there is weak and lack even of timely oversight over these particular contracts. So what we have seen in response to these challenges was in various countries, some of them take a problem-oriented approach. So they fix the particular issue, such as PPE Or in the case of countries where we are engaging in cash transfers, they fix the particular system that utilizes cash transfer. And or they combine this effort to fix that particular problem with fixing a part of the process. So, for example, um, in vaccine procurement, there is an effort to fix certain parts of the vaccine procurement chain. Those countries which decide to take a more systematic approach may take this opportunity to fix key institutions as well. So let's say fixing the processes and systems of the key agency of the health ministry that is coordinating the emergency response. Or else, if there are hospitals or a chain of hospitals that are working to respond to the pandemic, they try to fix at the institutional level these kinds of centers. But it brings to mind this whole discussion around what's happening on the public side is what about the private side, right? What are the accountabilities that need to be placed on the private side? So many cases in various sectors, such as infrastructure and health, not just that cases that the bank has looked at, but globally by various institutions, show that it really does take two to tango, right? So part of the problem of fraud and corruption comes from the private side of a particular scheme. There's also concern of the use of agents or intermediaries who present themselves to the private side to assure that private side that, look, if you work with us or if you play with us, we'll make sure that you can get access to the technical specifications or connect you to ensure that you at least become part of the shortlist or even win the contract. Um, Related to these are very troublesome collusive schemes. So a cartel might get together to dominate the supply of a particular component. Underpinning all of this is the lack of appreciation of both the private and public side of the need to ensure that there are no conflict of interest issues. So in the earlier example that I showed, wherein the local government official had a firm on the side and which managed to win a contract, right? Um, or else simply that firms will present themselves as being capable of supplying certain things when in fact they're not, and so they engage in fraud in order to win contracts. These are these are direct actions of the private side that impact on the quality and performance of the procurement system as a whole. So let's pause to consider here that yes, attention to rules and procedures to prevent corrupt practices is very important because it helps to um, ensure that everybody knows what the rules of the game are, which is to ensure that transparency and accountability are important. But over and over again, we find that it's important also to review whether program management systems and practices enhance not only efficiency of spending, but also transparency, accountability, and encourage outside or independent participation or observation in terms of the procurement process. We also think that in the midst of a pandemic and when engaging in emergency procedures, you need to rely on technical expertise, but not only on a single opinion. You need to look at technical expertise across a wide range of opinions and seek broader guidance and perhaps conduct surveys even to ensure that you're limiting as much as possible your exposure to fraud and corruption risk. Let me pause here and urge you to look at several online resources that are available to the public, to everybody. Open Contracting, for example, has a very good set of examples of of how transparency is enabled in government procedures. In our own situation, we have a public website where we publish uh, resources such as our research on the warning signs of fraud and corruption practices, as well as a list of sanctioned and debarred firms that are not allowed to engage in World Bank finance projects. So I'll stop here and welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Anna. Another very good presentation. So, a question for you. What would you say are the key preventative measures for the governance risk to be adopted to mitigate integrity risks in their response to COVID-19? So the key preventative measures that you think will be the most appropriate and effective.
Yeah. So the responses are highly contextual to what's available, right? To the current system. So we heard previously a very good presentation by Mr. Pillai on how the e-procurement system, for example, would be instrumental. But in situations where that's not available, um, we have quite frankly engaged in hands-on support, especially to those countries where procurement capacity is weak. So there is a procurement approach we're using, which is called hands-on support, where we directly help these countries with the procurement. So we ourselves would be engaged in facilitating the procurement. Now we also are urging countries to, let's say in the case of the vaccine procurement, right? One of the strategies is to align with the international effort to vet the quality of vaccines to be procured. And there is a global steering committee that, as well as the WHO and Gavi, which is banding together to collect experiences as well as to strategize on how vaccines would be allocated fairly around the world. And the bank is financing those types of vaccines that countries are deciding to use via that kind of network, right? So there's a lot of considerations in play to ensure the quality and efficacy of those things. Now, at the same time, we are working on the ground with UN agencies such as UNOPS and UNICEF, who are then coordinating the procurement and the distribution of certain key components. So that's the part where there's a lot of activity and volume of support directly from the bank. And then on the other hand, there are things that the client system needs to then pick up and deliver, right? And so we're trying to focus on ensuring that they are building their own kind of capabilities and systems to deliver these kinds of support. Now, on our side, we're actively monitoring any complaints that are coming in that might be related to our financing. And so that's work that our team does. And as a result of those complaints, we're proactively reaching out to those particular situations or projects wherein complaints are being detected so that those risks are being addressed as soon as possible. So there's a variety of responses that the bank is engaging in order to assist our clients respond to the emergency demands.
Okay, not dissimilar to ADB. Members of my
Yes.
team are sitting in with borrowers and vaccine manufacturers,
Yes.
and sitting in on the negotiation process. The only problem is because of the non-disclosure
Yes.
provisions. They can't tell me what's in the contract yet. So we're having to go to the manufacturers to get that removed so I can approve it or not approve it, as the case may be. Just one last question, and then we'll move on. I can answer the first one in chat, that do you suspend procurement reviews in the case of emergency procurement at the World Bank? ADB doesn't, and I know ENZO doesn't. It still gets reviewed.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, because of all these lessons we've learned, this is not the first emergency situation where we've, procurement has had to be engaged. There was the Ebola crisis, and there were other crises that have happened in the past. And so we're learning as an organization, right? So in the case of many countries that I cover, so that's South Asia and East Asia, there is a high volume as well of post-procurement review, right? So our audience might be familiar with the process of reviews prior to contracts being signed, but there's this whole process of reviewing post contracts, right? So even after contracts have been signed, and if there are anomalies that were detected as a result of those procurement, then as I mentioned, there's an effort to ensure that we're trying to proactively address.
Thank you
You're
very
right.
much.
You're right, Stephen.
We could keep going. I could
Yes.
keep going with all of you. I'm
No,
so
but-
very sorry.
Yeah. Thank you
but
for
we
the
have
time.
a limited amount of time. I would now like to move on to Steve Guppy, who was never as good at five-a-side football as I was. We used to play together in the 1980s, early 90s, who's the Director of Procurement for Crown Agents UK. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'll obviously have to dispute the five-a-side comment, but clearly you can grow a fantastic moustache, so congratulations.
Thank you, it's rather splendid.
on that. So yes, I'm the Procurement Director for Crown Agents. I will be sharing, if I can get the technology to allow me, a short presentation, but it won't be a huge PowerPoint process, so just bear with me while I get that up and running. But just whilst that is happening, if you could just give me a thumbs up, Jeff, or a yes if you can see my screen. Are you able to see that?
I'm not sure if I do in our presentation room. Could somebody in the main room?
No. Steve, it's we can see your face, not the presentation.
That's okay. I think it's coming through at the moment. But whilst that's loading, I think I'm just going to share the pain that has already been discussed in terms of the PPE scenario we had last year. An absolutely crazy situation. We were supplying PPE to over 50 countries. And so, that's very familiar, some of those issues. I'm not entirely sure what's happening with my screen here. I've now got a very
I think it's something to do with the next Matrix film, Steve.
It looks like it. Are you able to share it centrally, please, Anna? Or I'll have one last attempt from this side. But what I wanted to talk about was to explain some of the work that we're currently doing now in the vaccines. And again, thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Thank you to the World Bank and to IMA for the introduction and to the opportunity to speak at this excellent event, and of course for all the sponsors that have made it happen. Bill Gates said recently the world needs three things right now. It needs the capacity to produce billions of doses of vaccine. It needs the money to pay for it, and it needs the systems to deliver it. So that's where I wanted to talk to now in terms of the systems to deliver it. 56 days ago, on the 10th of December, Prashant and I were at a conference with the George Washington University talking about vaccine delivery. And I said at that point that the science had done its job in terms of getting us the vaccines, and the spotlight was now on the supply chain and the procurement family to deliver. so literally to deliver. And as a procurement and supply chain practitioner, I was excited and slightly terrified by the thought that was coming. But I was determined that we would not be the weak link in the chain, that the procurement and supply chain story would not be the one that the next generation tells when it tells the COVID story. The scientists in the labs have done their work, and we really now have to step up to the plate. So this is our thoughts on how we've started to do that, because when I was making those statements in December, we hadn't shipped a single dose of vaccine as Crown agents, and the task was all ahead of us. As I sit here 56 days later, that's a long time in the COVID vaccine story, and we've now undertaken 13 successful international shipments of the COVID vaccine. And I'd like just to then share some of our experiences and our lessons learned to this group, so that we can all share together and learn together, and so that we can avoid mistakes that we've seen in that process so far. Toby Peters, the professor of cold chain economy at the University of Birmingham here in the UK, said that this is the biggest logistical challenge the world has ever seen. Having now been doing it since early January, I tend to agree with him, but it's not impossible, as I'm going to show now. So I'm going to talk about 5 real key learnings that we've picked up. There are obviously a lot more that I could go into, but we only have 20 minutes, so I'll stick to the 5 that I've put on there. And just that picture that we're showing there is an arrival of vaccines in the Falkland Islands earlier this month, which we were very proud to be involved in. So it is actually happening, and we can see it working. But there's a few ingredients in this cake that I'd like us to think about as we go forward. So if we could just move the slide on, please, Ima. The first one really is this race against the clock. Thank you. We know that when we're dealing with this Pfizer vaccine movement, the actual supply chain task is simple. You need to move this box from this place to this place, and you have 84 hours in which to do it. Why 84 hours? Well, that's the time within which the Pfizer vaccine can be maintained at the required temperature in transit. So from the point of packaging and sealing to the point of arrival and putting in the refrigerated storage at the end destination, that's the ticking clock that we have. And of course, when you're dealing in such tight timelines and shipping things across the world in that period, you don't have any room for error. Handover points have to be planned with military precision. The paperwork has to be right. There are no special rules for shipping the COVID vaccine when it comes to customs clearance or customs declarations or x-raying products at airports. All of those things still have to take place, and they have to take place under this ticking clock of 84 hours. So it does need meticulous end-to-end planning, risk management, and route risk management to the extent of which I've never seen in my 30+ years of public procurement work. And all of that is necessary to ensure the successful delivery and optimum arrival conditions on site, because we all know that failure in this context is not an option. Failure to deliver the vaccines in optimum condition is not something we can countenance right now. In the last conference that we had, it was discussed that the vaccine was liquid gold. We cannot drop the ball on this, and we cannot deliver vaccine which is outside of its temperature range and affects its efficacy. There's too many things at stake, financially and health related, for that to happen. So it is a challenge, and it is a time race when you're dealing with the Pfizer distribution, but it is possible, and we've shown that it can be done. The second thing I wanted to show is around the externalization of the actual shipment, because we spend a lot of time talking about these numbers that we all know, -70 for Pfizer, between 2 to 8 for the AstraZeneca one. So is it a situation where, as long as we make sure we keep that box at that temperature, everything's okay? Well, actually, no. The external temperature is as important as the internal temperature, and that's something we learn very quickly. And in actual fact, when we're shipping the Pfizer vaccines, you might be surprised to know that our trucks moving from warehouse to airport actually have to have an inside temperature of between 15 and 25 degrees. So make sure that that Pfizer box, that cold box that they've packaged, doesn't go too high or too low outside of the outside temperature range as well. Because either of those scenarios would actually cause potential damage to the vaccine, as far as we understand, and have a negative impact on the shipment. So it's not only about making sure that we've got the ice boxes and the cold boxes in the packaging, or in the case of Pfizer, the dry ice, which is taken care of at packaging stage. But it's also making sure that at every point and every handover and every part of that chain, we are making sure that it's not being exposed externally to peaks and troughs of temperature spiking. When you have to factor in, of course, that at the moment in the UK, we're moving this, the nighttime temperatures, hit zero. That's a challenge. You've got to factor in that the cargo could possibly sit on a tarmac before it's loaded for a period of time. That becomes a challenge. And even in a warehouse scenario, it's not as straightforward as you may think. And if you could just move on to the next slide, please, Ima. This is just an example of how we're tracking temperature of those vaccines. And you can see there that at this point, so at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning, a few days ago, one of these boxes that we were tracking here dipped below the temperature range, the required temperature range. Why was that? It was because through nothing more sinister than someone moved the box from one part of the warehouse to another, and that part of the warehouse was colder than where it had been previously, and that took it outside of that range that we wanted it stored in. Luckily, through real-time smart tracking, you can pick that up straight away. You get a message on your phone to say this box is now outside of temperature range. A quick phone call to the warehouse, can you please put that box back where it was? Oh yes, fine, we were just moving it because of the delivery was coming soon. No, keep it there until the truck arrives, do not move it. So those sorts of things can be dealt with through smart tracking and tracing solutions with these boxes, and that's something that's fairly consistent now anyway as part of good distribution practice for pharmaceutical movements. But those sorts of things are possibly considerations that we wouldn't think about when we're talking about moving the vaccine, because all the publicity is around the -70 or around the 2 to 8 cold chain. So that's happened actually only this week, as you can see from the date there on the tracker. So there's two immediate sort of issues straight away in terms of the ticking clock, the 84 hours, and the external temperature control. We know from experience as well that things will go wrong. Even though you can plan to a military degree, things will change and things will happen. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So we were already shipping. That's fine. You can stay there. You can. That's the situation when we were shipping to the overseas territories, for example, for the UK government. So we're already shipping a challenging product in strict guidelines in a highly regulated environment and in hard to reach destinations. That's a pretty tricky task in itself. And added onto that, we've got these COVID restrictions that we all know about. So these keys, as I say, is this thorough contingency planning, but things still do go wrong. On the 5th of January, for example, this year, the UK went back into lockdown. Most international air travel was suspended, aircraft availability reduced, unpredictability as airlines ground their flights, as they change their routes, they stop flying, they cut back on the number of air travel. And as most of you will know, a lot of vaccines and a lot of pharmaceuticals are carried in the bellies of those aircraft. So how do we then solve that problem? If your actual main source of shipment, international freight, has gone. Also, if you can find a carrier that can take it, then there's the dry ice challenge. Now, again, dry ice is what's being used, as we know, in the Pfizer boxes to keep the boxes cold. But there is actually a restriction on the amount of dry ice that you can carry on a single aircraft. So even though a 747 may have 90 metric ton capacity for cargo, it may only have 500 kilograms capacity for dry ice. So that's all you can get on. So it's not about the weight of, you know, the actual capacity on the plane itself. It's about how much dry ice they're allowed to take, because obviously it is a hazard product. So then you start thinking about other options, like military aircraft, as we can see here. So the military are being used. We've already used the military 4 times in our shipments of the vaccine, including the one that you see there, which was arriving into Gibraltar only a few weeks ago. Now, I don't know about you, but if anybody's been on a military aircraft, I can tell you they're not designed for comfort. And what was the impact of having a vaccine on a military aircraft for 15 hours, suffering from heavy vibration and from heavy shaking? Had any of that ever been tested? Do we know what the impact of the quality of a vaccine could be if that is occurring? So that was something we learned straight away, that actually military aircraft, huge vibration, what's the challenges, what are the issues, what are the impacts on the vaccine and the quality of the vaccine. I can tell you that we've had it checked out and actually it's okay, but these are big questions that come up as you're starting to move through the process. And again, in terms of expect the unexpected, as we said, you know, there are things that are changing all the time here. Only this week we had a delivery that was going into a UK airport and the temperature controlled warehouse was suddenly closed due to COVID restrictions. So the flight was leaving in 4 hours time. So, you know, we couldn't get that product in to a warehouse. We couldn't get it into a temperature controlled environment. So you have to think really quickly and come up with a plan B for how you deal with that solution. And, you know, it seems obvious, but in the heat of trying to get these things moved, sometimes the obvious is forgotten. You know, backup plans, trucks will break down, drivers will go sick, punctures will happen, and it's just how we respond and handle those issues, given that we've still got 84 hours to do the job. So, like any good Bollywood movie, Hollywood movie, football team, it's not a one-person show. We know that. This job needs a strong cast of actors, all knowing their roles, all performing their parts to the best of their ability, working as a team and being professional every hour of the day and night. Now, you know, I guess as Crown agents, we're in a fairly fortunate position because we've had a long history of delivering, you know, to last mile logistics. It's easier to do than for me to say, it seems, to some of the hardest locations in the world. And we're no strangers to shipping medical medicines and medical devices across the globe, even into war zones. So we had an infrastructure, we had a muscle memory, we had a corporate memory of how to do this from Ebola and from other things. And we had an infrastructure around our internal capacity and our partners and our networks to help us to do this. And we're still developing some of that. But that's been, as Jeff will know from many years ago, that's been something we've been doing for decades. But I guess what I'm saying is we know that kind of infrastructure doesn't get built overnight. And I think one of the keys that we've learned is that using those trusted supply chain routes, using those key partners and trusted players that have done this in the industry before, whether it's tagging on to other supply chain routing in the private sector, for example. Let's use what exists, let's use the knowledge that is there already, and let's not try and reinvent things, because there is skills and knowledge out there that we need to tap into as a public sector to get this job done. So trying to reinvent wheels now is not going to help us. We need to use the infrastructure that's there and the knowledge that's there. I think the last thing I wanted to say, if you could move on to the next slide for me, is that it might seem pretty obvious what I'm about to say, but I've put this quote up there because I think it's quite appropriate at the moment. You know, every high civilization decays by forgetting the obvious. So what are the obvious things that we've learned from our discussions with governments and with development partners and others through this process? And if you could just go on, just to flick through, I've got a few thoughts here I wanted to leave you with. The first one is an obvious one. You know, a vaccine without a syringe is no good to anybody. You know, we still need syringes, we still need the needles, we still need the ancillaries to come through at the same time. And then we're thinking, well, you know, syringes and vaccines are great, but then we need the vaccinators, the trained vaccinators to use them. So what are the contingency plans? What plans do governments have in place to actually get that lab to jab process so that we actually get the vaccine in the arm? And that's all well and good, but those vaccinators also need protection. So we're still talking about the challenges of masks and gloves and other things that we've just been discussing there. I think though there is good news. If you could just move on to the next piece, please. I'm sorry, I'm not able to. Yeah, carry on. And you know, also what we're really seeing at the moment is a real challenge in some countries that we're working in still the patient care. You know, this patient care is still not. We haven't solved this yet as the human race. We haven't decided what we're doing about this properly. There are still challenges. We are still seeing people with oxygen shortages in the world. We are still seeing lack of beds and lack of equipment and lack of ICUs in some areas. We still need to keep on with that. We can't take our eye off that ball just because we've got a vaccine, because this is still a huge challenge, as we all know. I say it sounds obvious. It sounds, you know, like we're telling you what everybody already knows, but as we said, high civilization decays from forgetting the obvious. So let's keep focused on those issues and those challenges. Just in summary, if we could go on to the last slide, I just wanted to then summarize what I've been discussing. It isn't simple to move these vaccines, but it isn't impossible. We've proved that. It is high pressured, it is intense, it is unpredictable. The 84-hour ticking clock is a challenge, but it can be done. But it is a team effort and it needs everybody to be working together. And there is good news, as the last slide will show, which is the vaccines are arriving in countries. We are managing to get them there. And just my final personal reflections when I think back on the workshop I did on the 10th of December, when I said I don't want the supply chain to be the weak link in this process. So far it isn't, and I'm very proud that as a community the global procurement response is stepping up to the plate. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve. That was a fascinating presentation from somebody with hands-on experience and who's obviously sat next to a box of vaccines going to somewhere cold, in somewhere cold. And it does put me in mind of some of the research we've done at ADB, that actually the cost of a vaccine is a minor component of the vaccine distribution program. Depending on the base cost of the vaccine, somewhere between 10 and 40%. So between 60 and 90% is everything surrounding the vaccine's delivery system, the cold chain, the health professionals, the pharmacopoeial vigilance required to register adverse effects, patient records, and obviously something you're highlighting there, for highly sensitive vaccines, the need for a GPS tracking system with temperature monitoring. And that won't actually be in place broadly across many of the countries that we work in. And certainly I put to in mind of the Philippines, where the ambient temperature never gets below 28 anywhere. It's 28 to 36, and that's what you get year round. And it takes 86 hours to get out of Manila with the traffic. But certainly some great insight there. And really, one of the keys to this, I think, doing it successfully, and we're working with the World Bank, COVAX, Gavi, and others on this, is the vaccine readiness assessment. For example, in the Philippines, Pfizer may not be the solution because of logistics, because of ambient temperature, because of the transport infrastructure. It's 4,000 islands and so forth. It might not be the right one. It could be a great vaccine, and it does appear to be. Thankfully, my mum's got it, so I hope it is. But it's got to be fit for purpose as well. Really encourage the early signs of the distribution. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we'll move on to Professor Prashant Yadav, Senior Fellow of the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. Prashant, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks everyone. This is an important and very interesting and also time-sensitive topic. So thanks to the World Bank, ADB, EMA, others for organizing this session. What I wanted to do was talk about how the challenges in vaccine procurement and the procurement of other supplies have been challenging in North America, in the US, in countries in Europe, and what could be things that we can learn from that for procurement elsewhere. And again, I do a lot of work on distribution and supply chains, and have been looking at the rollouts of vaccines across countries, India, Israel, UK, US, and have written some about it, but that's not the core of what I'll be talking about this evening. It'll be largely on procurement. So let me see if I can share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, Prashant. Challenges
Okay,
in
excellent.
COVID-19 procurement.
Okay, excellent. So as we think about the vaccine supply chain from end to end, which means from the manufacture of key input materials all the way to the point of dispensing, many interesting procurement challenges come up. And these are the things which have led to a great degree of public scrutiny and also political tensions that have emerged. Examples being, which vaccine candidates did a country or a region invest in, and was it the right thing to do? Did they overinvest in one type? Did they underinvest in another type? And invest here isn't just making a grant to a vaccine developer. Invest here is advance purchase agreements to buy a certain quantity of a vaccine. So the European Union, the UK, the US, Canada, each bought or made advance purchase agreements in sometime between July till it's still ongoing actually till the last weeks. And there is significant heterogeneity in which vaccine candidates did each country do the advance purchase agreements with and what quantity. And so in retrospect, as you'd imagine, there is a lot of pressure and a lot of questions being asked, which means, was it the right choice being made and so on. So there is uncertainty about which vaccine candidate to invest in, because not all of them have yet gone through the trials. And yes, we have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 vaccines which have received emergency use authorization, but the technology landscape is still evolving, which means we still need to think about what is the optimal portfolio to purchase. So just a quick word on the steps involved. So we need to think about auxiliary supplies such as vials and syringes coming together, and then vaccine manufacturing essentially has 2 steps, and I'll get to why it is important to understand this from a procurement manager standpoint in a minute. So the first being bulk vaccine manufacturing, or manufacturing the drug substance, and the second is the formulation fill and finish, where you are actually filling the vaccine along with some additional material in some cases into a packaging container, which is a vial, and then into a secondary packaging container, which could be a specialized box or a routine packaging container. And then when we think about vials and syringes, they are not generic commodities. What I mean by that is, let's take the example of syringes. Which syringe to use is in a way connected to which vaccine are you buying. And especially when we think about auto-disposable syringes, when we think about injection safety, the Pfizer-Moderna vaccine, so the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, for example, has a 0.3 ml dose, and many of the WHO pre-qualified syringes were not, the WHO pre-qualified auto-disposable syringes were not for the 0.3 ml, which means it is there isn't a product which could draw 0.3 ml in the auto-disposable injection safety domain. Now we have that. There was a rapid effort, and HMD, in fact, in India, is one of those pre-qualified suppliers for the 0.3 ml. So those are tactical things which we sometimes forget, that the syringe and the vaccine type will require some matching. Same thing is true with the types of vials. We also have seen many countries asking the question, should they buy ultra cold chain equipment or should they not buy ultra cold chain equipment? So even before getting into where to purchase it from, what kind of supplier, before getting into the technical specs is a question of, should we invest in ultra cold chain? And that once again goes back to, are you buying only a small quantity of the messenger RNA vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, or will this be the mainstream product for vaccinating in your country? And also there is some uncertainty about thermostability of the vaccines, which means it could very well be that in 6 months to 8 months time from now, we find out that Pfizer, BioNTech do additional thermostability studies and realize that their vaccine is in fact more thermostable than we thought. And as a result, any significant investment in ultra cold chain or ultra cold freezers may not be as necessary, or may not get us as much value for money. So that's an uncertainty. The other things which have come up are, should we have a government contract for dry ice, or should that be done much more decentralized? Same thing with contracts for air cargo capacity. Should we have advanced air cargo capacity contracts? Should we wait till we know what will be the origin destination that will be necessary, which means which manufacturer and which manufacturing site will be picking up the vaccines from? Without knowing that, can we still book cargo capacity, and acknowledging that it's becoming a constraint and has been a constraint throughout the last 7 months? There is a very difficult question which has come up in many countries now, including the UK and the US, Canada more recently. And this will be a question that will also come up in many low and middle income countries, including World Bank and ADB recipient countries, which is, should governments have capacity options for fill and finish capacity? Should they procure capacity for fill and finish instead of buying or purchasing only vaccines? And I'll get to why that becomes a tricky area. So anyway, so these are some of the challenges which procurement managers face. And I think one thing which is important, this is similar to what Steve was highlighting. So on one side, we've seen that the role of procurement and supply chain management has come a lot into the limelight, but also the expectation from procurement managers to be more than executing on defined product specifications, versus playing the role of technology scouting, trying to understand what is coming from the technology pipeline, how to think about a portfolio early on. Those are things which have become much more asked and much more expected from national health procurement managers, at least in the US, UK, and EU. And I would assume similarly in many of the countries, including certainly in India, and was glad to hear some of the things that Vinod described from HLL Life Care standpoint. Okay, so one of the most important questions that has been a source of tension here is, what should be the locus of procurement for different types of products needed, including for vaccines? So the range of options, there is a continuum. A country can purchase all of its supplies from COVAX, which is the Global Procurement collaboration set up by the WHO and Gavi and others like CEPI. Should they think about regional multi-country procurement, similar to the way the African Union's supply management platform has done for all countries in Africa, the European Union has done for the EU? Should they think about each country doing its own national procurement, which has been a mainstay model in the past? Should there be subnational procurement, such as what we've seen in the case of in the US, there have been some states who have said we are going to go and have a direct contract with one particular manufacturer and buy for our state separately from how the federal government is negotiating. That hasn't moved forward. But the fact that these questions kept coming up and created tensions reminds us of something which has been a long-standing and somewhat intrinsic trade-off in procurement, which is if you do more decentralized procurement, you have richer local information. You also have higher agility, which means you can do things quickly because you know what is needed. But then you lose the economies of scale and scope. You have issues around quality assurance and price, right? So those are the two things we've always learned how to balance as good procurement managers. But COVID-19 has added some new dimensions to this trade-off, largely around delivery terms, which means people are asking the question, I will go with global or regional or national or sub-national, depending on where can I get the best delivery terms. If I can get a supplier to deliver me 1 million doses of vaccines in the next 6 weeks, I'm willing to change the routine structure I use, whether it's global, regional, national, and I'll do it more direct. And that tension has raised this question in a slightly different way than we have traditionally addressed in procurement. It requires us to answer, in times like this, how do we ensure that we have both global coordination working well, but at the same time, not compromising delivery terms because a country is joining a global procurement or is joining a regional multi-country procurement effort. So that trade-off continues to be something to look at. So the biggest question that many countries were facing and the procurement teams who were writing these large advanced purchase contracts were facing in US, UK, and Europe, at least the ones that we were connecting with, were saying, what is an optimal portfolio? Who should we do advanced purchase contracts with? Which vaccine candidates? And this is still in October or earlier. So at that time, we didn't know which vaccines are already going to get approved or emergency use authorized. So we had to start our own effort to understand the probability of success of each of the vaccine platforms, because there was nothing like this available for COVID-19 vaccine platforms in particular. So some colleagues and I got together and we did this large effort of understanding the probability of success. But just understanding the probability of success of each vaccine platform is not sufficient to build a portfolio, because as we know, to build a portfolio or an optimal portfolio, we also need to understand the correlation in the probability of success across platforms. What I mean by that is, if a messenger RNA vaccine succeeds, does it tell us something about other messenger RNA vaccines? Well, are they more likely to succeed, less likely? If a replicating viral vector succeeds, does it tell us something about a non-replicating viral vector? If one inactivated succeeds, does it tell us about other inactivated virus vaccines and so on? And that helps understand, should we hedge our risks in the right way so that we have made advanced purchase contracts with the right number and type of vaccine manufacturers, so that in the end, when all of this uncertainty is resolved, we have access to 1, 2, or 3 safe and efficacious vaccines in the right quantities. And then is this question of not just the probability of success, but time to approval, because there has been such a mad rush in terms of, country A has already started its vaccination program, country B is still waiting. The US and UK started earlier, Europe is behind. So what can we do in Europe to make things go faster? How can we buy more supplies? So as a result, we also looked at the time. And as you see, a large clustering of vaccines that are likely to be approved across vaccine platforms will be still farther out. The ones that we've seen on the early stages of approval, 5 to 10 months from the start of when we did the study. And so I guess the question of how to determine an optimal portfolio still remains somewhat unanswered and remains to be a cause of tension. We did try and understand the covariance in the probabilities of success to some extent in our work. But what this has highlighted is that the role of procurement, which the bottom things you see here, which are which are things that we've done, more often, such as, how do you define a procurement strategy? Do you buy locally, centrally, globally? What are the key attributes of supplier selection? How do you split volumes between different suppliers? So the tactics of procurement, which are things we focused on, including things such as transparency, price comparison. But if you look up, we realize that the functions of scanning the technology horizon, what technologies are coming, are in the horizon, still not approved, is a function that requires the procurement function to work very closely with the science bodies in the government. And that cusp, or that way of working closely with the science bodies, has not been successful anywhere that I have studied yet. The reason is that the procurement groups are not as deeply embedded in the science advisory roles, which are helping determine what technologies are coming. And yes, there are some national task forces which are bringing them together, but a separate group is deciding what technologies are we likely going to deploy in our country, and then that is moving on to procurement. And then procurement is tasked with signing either advanced purchase agreements if the technology has not yet been approved by the regulator, or actual purchase contracts if it has been approved by the regulator. So I think that's something we need to fix and get it working together. In the absence of that, we will continue to see the kinds of accountability, finger pointing, politics that we've seen in multiple countries around vaccine procurement. Retrospective views on the US should have contracted more doses with Pfizer BioNTech. Europe should have contracted more with Moderna. Why didn't they do it? So those kind of retrospective look backs will keep coming back. It does come with the risk that we will end up taking procurement into a relatively inexperienced territory for many of our procurement colleagues, and as a result take on the risk of public scrutiny falling on us. But I, in my opinion, believe that's a risk which the global procurement community cannot shy away from. We would have to take that. We would have to become smarter and better at understanding many of the parts around it. So this is the part I'm referring to. Then is this question of should governments contract for fill and finish manufacturing capacity? And it remains to be a hotly debated topic. The idea here is that if you look at the drug substance or the antigen manufacturing, that is very different for each vaccine type, right? So whether it's a messenger RNA or a inactivated virus or a adenovirus vector candidate, the biological reactors are different, the steps are different, the equipment is different. But when it gets to fill and finish, they are very similar. You can't overnight change a line, but the manufacturing assets are very similar to do one versus the other. So while it remains unclear which country will get access, will buy which type of vaccine, one area that is emerging is, should we do public contracting of fill and finish manufacturing capacity? So in the US, we have what is known as the Federal Fill and Finish Manufacturing Network, where the federal government contracts with fill and finish manufacturers in 3 or 4 locations in the country and keeps their capacity ready for use in the case of a pandemic like this one, but even before that. So as a result, as long as you can find someone to manufacture the drug substance, whosoever has developed the vaccine first, you can very quickly do fill and finish. We are seeing Canada invest in fill and finish. We've seen the UK invest in fill and finish with public dollars. We are seeing the European Union invest in fill and finish with public dollars. So on one side, people will say, well, what you're referring to is public investments that will be a part of World Bank projects. That's not technically procurement. But in some cases, they are not dollars, or they are not pounds or euros or rupees going into building manufacturing plants, they are going into buying capacity options to say, every year we'll give you X amount of money to keep your capacity ready to fill and finish in the event of a pandemic. Right now we have an immediate need, but in the future we may have more. And so it raises the question, how would we procure such fill and finish capacity? And would we as a procurement community say, we'll bring all of our expertise to bear to design the right way of having fill and finish manufacturing capacity, which then would translate into things that will start showing up in proposals to the World Bank, to the Asian Development Bank. They will then face the question, should they approve it in this format? Is that the right thing to fund? So I think I want to highlight things where, the common theme across my presentation here is I want to highlight places where there is tension. Where we can easily resolve it, we know the answer. It's about execution. I commend people who are working on implementing, executing, but I think the bigger questions in front of us are, why did we see tensions emerge in some areas, and are we doing enough so that in the future, those are not areas which become tensions, but become a part of a well-established, somewhat smooth system that everybody accepts the core principles of, and then we can act and execute on. So COVID-19 in general, not just for vaccines, has reminded us that we all operate somewhere in this three-vertex pyramid or triangle of responsiveness, agility, and cost efficiency. And again, this is nothing new to you all, but even for vaccines, this has reminded us that we may be operating closer to where the red dot lies, which is where cost efficiency is, and purchasing based on least price clause for things such as vaccines is highly suboptimal because it is leading to significant compromises in agility and responsiveness. A very clear example of this is if you look at all of the types of vaccines, some are cheaper, some are more expensive, but we also have to think about which one is more agile, and here agility would mean which one is more versatile and robust to new variants, which one is more versatile to addressing future pathogens that may come our way, which is a more flexible manufacturing platform, which is almost like plug and play. And to what extent are we willing to compromise cost efficiency in order to get that agility? Will you think about buying, and I think Jeff hinted about value for money at the start of this, but I think the value for money conversation is trickier, even more trickier than what I would argue Jeff described, because it's not just about value for money and cost effectiveness for the price of the vaccine and the cost of delivering it. It's also about what will be the future benefit of building capacity for a type of a vaccine. If we invest in messenger RNA today, yes, it is hard, logistics are challenging, maybe Philippines should not invest in it. But if we realize that messenger RNA is the only technology that is versatile, can help us for protection and preparedness against future pathogens, maybe it is a salient investment and is value for money, because then we are taking some future benefits and taking their discounted present value into our value for money equation. So I think those are, once again, areas where I just want to remind all of us that we cannot shy away from doing detailed analyses on some of these, helping our non-procurement counterparts in government, people who are oftentimes jumping the gun and getting very quickly to some decisions, acting as the reminders or in a way the guardians of value for money in many respects. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. An excellent question. And I agree with you on the value for money point. One of your comments put me in mind of the procurement nirvana, batch size or lot size one, and truly flexible manufacturing and supply chains, which are nirvana we won't ever get to, but flexibility in the supply chains. One of the things we are seeing emerging, and of course we're a bank, we lend money, is countries actually considering and thinking about building their own capacity. It's the old procurement question, make or buy. There are a number of countries across the region, India being, of course, with the Serum Institute, a very important player in that market and already licensed, I believe, to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine under license. I mean, one of the challenges that hits us with, though, as procurement or international procurement is that the emergency use authorizations issued by the SRAs and issued by WHO are facility specific and manufacturer specific. So, you know, if we look at the AstraZeneca EU SRA, which we have, not that we're allowed to see it, but we have, it is specific to 3 plants, specific locations, because of their GMP practices. And that's going to be another challenge moving forward. Recognizing, of course, within a national environment, the regulator can approve for the national needs. But that complicates issues when you go internationally, where World Bank and ADB are saying the standard is an SRA or WHO. But the AstraZeneca SRA in the UK and now in the EU, and I think perhaps soon in the US, I'm not sure, it is only specific to the plants there. It is not covering the other potential manufacturing facilities, which I believe, certainly I know of in India, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and Indonesia, all have their own indigenous vaccine industry. But that was really fascinating. I've got a few questions in chat. Instead, and I'll do a summation, I think, just after these questions instead of the other way round. Thank you. There's one for Steve and Crown Agents, or representing Crown Agents, not the Crown Agent. Is there one anymore, Steve? So don't worry about answering that one. Is there a risk of substandard and falsified supplies and consumables entering into supply chains? Steve, what would you do to mitigate against those?
Yes, always. And I do apologise. My neighbours have just started drilling, so hopefully you're not picking that up on the microphone. But there is a risk always, and that's not specific to what we're facing now in the COVID situation. I mean, that's always been there, and that's always been a challenge. And yes, there are mitigations that we put in place to protect us against those things, from ranging from initial due diligence on suppliers and sort of assessing manufacturing plants and facilities, quality certifications or paper-based quality certification, self-certification, right through to the physical inspection of product at the end before it leaves the factory. So yes, there is always a risk of substandard and falsified product in any procurement situation. And yeah, we have to, as procurement professionals, be alive and alert to that, and we do have a number of policies and practices that we all use to sort of mitigate those scenarios. There is no single sort of silver bullet, if you like, to sort of solve that problem. It's just a consistent sort of chain and of being diligent and being alert to where those things are happening. I probably get 40 or 50 emails a week from people telling me that they supply PPE, and we look them up and they've never supplied PPE in their lives. I mean, you have to be careful. You have to be diligent. We had during the situation last year, we had people telling us that they had ventilators in stock in the UK. In the north of the UK, this is the time when ventilators, were prime demand, and somebody told us they had sort of a big stock of ventilators ready to go in the UK. We have, as Jeff will know, we have a warehouse facility up in Liverpool in the north of England. It was actually sort of an hour's drive away from this said facility where they had these ventilators. So we just drove over there and took a look, and there was no ventilators, there was no warehouse. So you just have to be really vigilant and diligent in terms of, if it's too good to be true, it generally is.
Yeah, so the due diligence that you should apply normally will apply doubly. Absolutely,
and we were able to do, and now and another webinar seminar I was on, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, was talking about how do you do due diligence in an emergency situation. It's even more important to do it in an emergency situation because there's so many people out there trying to make a quick buck, unfortunately, off the back of something.
And I think that will go to some of Anna's earlier points as well. on similar issue. Prashant, I've got an easy question for you. Getting the answer right, there's a Nobel Prize in it. I'm not sure in which area it would be. But Prashant, I mean, to better manage future pandemics, from what we've learned so far about COVID distribution, do you think we are getting it right, or what could we do to improve it? For the global public good, no less.
Yeah, so I think two things. So one is things which many of us, and I include myself in that, have stressed in the past on, lean and staggered procurement deliveries, and the idea that instead of getting your procurement deliveries twice a year, you should try to get them every month. That way you won't have a lot of inventory, things will be moving faster. We've learned that people who I was telling this to a year ago have been sending me messages on WhatsApp saying, I'm grateful I did not take your advice, and I have 1 year of stock of medicine sitting in my warehouse and I have nothing to worry about. Those who took your advice, Prashant, are the ones who are probably running helter-skelter. So I think it has reminded us that the concept of buffer stocks and strategic stockpiling are important areas for health emergencies, and we may have underinvested in them through public monies in the past. The second is...
and the public sector is notorious holding outdated inventory and not replenishing it.
Yeah, so we have to manage the stockpiles well. I mean, they shouldn't just become a place where things come, sit, and then get expired and get thrown out. We can manage and turn the inventory quickly, but still we need to hold some more in buffer stock. The second thing we've learned is that the communication, accountability, and information flow between different levels of the government is the part which is a make or break factor in much of how the COVID how medical supply chain functions. We invest and think a lot about things such as technology, information systems, but I think much simpler things such as, does the state, the district, and the central government have a clear way of communicating what they're buying, what their needs are, what has been purchased, what has been delivered. And in places where it was working well, because either the central or the federal government had a stronger hold on this, or somehow the information structures were seamless, have done exceptionally well in running their supply chains. In places where this was not the case, we have done poorly. And that is the biggest predictor of supply chains working or not working in COVID-19, irrespective of the infrastructure investments, irrespective of the GNP per capita of the country, or any other things which we used to think would be more useful predictors. So I think that's an important takeaway as well.
Okay, Prashant, thank you very much. Anna, I've got a question for you. And we touched on this earlier with Vinod as well. E-procurement and its role in governance, in emergency procurement and procurement in response to COVID-19. Could you give me your thoughts on the usefulness of e-procurement and governance?
Yes, thank you. I saw the question earlier as well. So just a quick update. So e-procurement has been rolled out in a number of countries, and we've been observing what's been going on. So some have been functioning okay, but one thing that seems to be missing is a complaints module that needs to be plugged into the system when it's rolled out. Because if bidders have no recourse within the system that they're using to submit complaints, then it doesn't really engender trust on the part of the market to participate in the e-procurement. The other thing is that the system needs to be continuously updated and made secure, and as well as it needs to be accessible to all the possible bidders. And lastly, there needs to be greater transparency around how the awards are being decided. And independent cross checks are definitely needed to ensure that the system is operating transparently. As a method, e-procurement is certainly, an advanced or a new way of doing things, but it can be manipulated as well. It's not the only solution that solves some of the problems that we have seen in the integrity area, right? So basically, it doesn't, for example, solve the problem of conflict of interest. Um, it doesn't also solve the problem of outside communication that may be going on between a procurement entity and a bidder that it wants to favor. So it's definitely a step forward, but there are additional things that need to be done in order to improve it and secure it.
Yeah, it's not a complete panacea, to use the language of the current industry. This is a question for Vinod and Steve both. In terms of how have the insurance markets responded in terms of COVID-19, PPE, vaccines, and equipment? Is it possible to get the traditional warehouse-to-warehouse insurance on it?
Yes, I think, since you have touched upon the topic of e-procurement, if everybody agrees, I would like to give a small, a couple of minutes this thing on what is happening in GEM, because that was one of the points which came up. See, GEM means under a certain category you put a bid. We call it a bid. You create a bid in the GEM, requesting for so and so quantity of so and so item. Then the parties who quote are not known. There's only let us say 4 parties are quoted. Only the what are the rates they are quoted is only known. There is the party's name, so there is no external communication with the party prior to the pricing being open. One. Second is that, let us say, the documents which are required against this particular bid are not as per your requirement. You may reject the bid. Then you give a time for about a week or 3 to 4 days time for the party to respond back against that disqualification. So that is also there, so that if at all there is a problem, they come back stating that no, your disqualification is not correct, or I can provide these documents also to show that I am also a qualified party for this particular activity. So there is a 2-bid system. One is the technical part, and second is the price part. So the technical part, once we reject the party on a technical part, then they can come back, as I told you, within 3-4 days time. Once the technical acceptance is made, only the price comes onto the e-procurement portal. Once the prices are coming onto the portal, there is no way you can change that pricing again. There is no negotiation, nothing. This sacrosanct in GEM. And there also, if you look at it, there is a automatic splitting. For example, now Make in India priority is there, or there is some preference for Make in India. There is also preference for micro and small scale industries. All these are inbuilt into the system, and based on that, whatever the notification of the government with regard to the procurement from these entities, it automatically, the quantity gets split automatically, subject to the L2 party matching the price of the L1 party. And in some cases, if it is a MSC, they get a preference on the price also. All that calculations are done inbuilt into the GEM portal itself. So there is a lot of advantages. So it becomes very transparent in the sense that I don't have to have any apprehension that somebody will point a finger at all back at me, stating that no, this was unfair. It is totally transparent. And even with regard to the MNC procurement, we had done procurement through GEM for coveralls and for masks, and it was a very clean and safe way to go about it. That is one. Second, with the insurance part, see, that point of time, we are a government of India enterprise. That is, we are not the government fully. It is a government of India enterprise under the Health and Family Welfare Ministry. So we had to set up our own infrastructure with regard to storage and distribution of the various PPE kit components. So whatever the transit insurance we could take easily, we could take, and we already, our company has already got a transit insurance policy in place. So what we did is that we extended the value or enhanced the value and the locations. What could be there, based on which the insurance part was not a problem at all.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Vinod. And Steve, how's the Institute of Underwriters responded in terms of international carriage insurance? Or have they told you to get lost?
Hasn't been the biggest problem we've faced, to be honest. I mean, so I mean, we're actually in the process of procuring vaccine at the moment for one country, and you know, we've been able to get insurance on that without much of a challenge. So I don't think it's been particularly, in our experience yet, a minefield.
Okay, good. Prashant, you had a...
I was going to say very briefly, I think there are new efforts at using sensors, Internet of Things sensors on vaccine shipments to change the way insurers view the risk. So there is a new effort by Lloyd's jointly with a company called Parcel, where you put sensors on the vaccine shipment, and that gives the insurer greater confidence about the shipment, and therefore the premium and the underwriting costs are going down. Or in some cases where the insurer is not willing to provide insurance in certain markets, they are now more willing. So I think that's a new development that's also worth keeping in mind for at least some countries where it has been harder in the past.
Okay, that's encouraging news from both of you. Thank you very much. I think I will end it now with a summary. I think it's been, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you and the Institute. And really, I think, you know, in summation, the light at the end of the tunnel might not be a train. It might be the end of the tunnel. But as Steve was saying, you know, it's very exciting and very encouraging. And I think the existence of viable vaccines creates a very significant amount of pressure in every one of our respective countries, with the demands of citizens wanting to be vaccinated and feel safe as soon as possible. And there's an imperative to that. And you know, you see what's been described as vaccine nationalism, but I completely understand it. It is a government's job to look after its population as best it can, which is why they voted for them. You know, and if they don't, they won't vote for them again. And governments are generally fairly self-serving in that respect. So we'll try and meet the needs of their citizens. One of the encouraging things, and I'm wanting to see, and I'm very interested to see how COVAX will develop out of this. And I think, was it Monday or Tuesday, there have been some private communications on allocations through COVAX. I'm going to see if we can get hold of those and certainly talk with our partner governments, see how much is being allocated to them from that first tranche release, because I think across much of developing Asia, which is exclusively where ADB works, although Asia does go as far as Georgia and Fiji, so it's a broad description. But it goes as well, I think, Professor, to your point about the vaccine portfolio as well. If certain vaccines are being allocated through COVAX and it's Moderna or it's Pfizer or it's AstraZeneca, what are the other vaccines? And, you know, is it advisable or possible to have multiple vaccines in a single market? For example, Solomon's, Fiji, Solomon's maybe makes sense, small population. Palau has done exactly that. Fiji, it's a bit bigger. You know, it's millions, maybe not. Indonesia, Philippines, India, probably not possible. The population is just too large to actually target a single vaccine. And Steve, some really fascinating insight about sitting next to boxes, going to visit penguins. Did you do the Falklands trip, or did you make somebody else do it?
We've got someone on the flight this week who's going to Anguilla. One of the team is on that flight now, so he put his hand up to spend 3 days in the Caribbean, which was a bit of a tough gig given that it's minus degrees here in London. So yeah, hard job.
Yeah, well, it's a summer in the Falklands, so it probably would have been at least +3.
But no, we are. Yeah, some of our team are on those flights. So yeah, sitting alongside the vaccines in those shaky military aircraft.
Yeah, I used to work with Steve at Crown Agents many years ago, and we called it the egg, lettuce, and tomato team, which is the emergency logistics team. All ex-RAF guys, but we called them egg, lettuce, and tomato. Well, okay, I would like to thank everybody here for their active participation. I hope the audience found it useful and will help contribute to their efforts to fight the pandemic and mitigate its impact and get back to really fully functioning economies and life, if you will, as soon as we're able. So thank you very much, Prashant, Vinod, and Anna. And all of the organisers, much appreciated. I've caught it from you, Steve. Thank you very much,
everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Enlightening.
Stay safe.
It was wonderful to hear knowledge points from Mr. Vinod G. Pillai, Ms. Anna Pinto Hebert, Mr. Steve Guppy, Professor Prashant Yadav. Mr. Taylor, thank you so much for chairing the session. We were immensely benefited by the rich experience of yours. With this, we come to an end of the session. Thank you so much once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's have a round of applause. Thanks once again. Now we move on, and it's a pleasure for me to invite Dr. Gurbandhani Kaur, Faculty IMA and Head Procurement Vertical IMA. Let's welcome Gurbandhani with a round of applause once again. And we request her to sum up the summit.
On behalf of All India Management Association, I would like to take this opportunity to conclude the event. I'm sure that these 2 days would have given deep insights into procurement management for post-COVID period. During the summit, we tried to address range of diverse procurement issues, including contract management and dispute resolution during the emergency situation, controlling fraud and corruption in emergency procurement, automation, challenges related to infrastructure projects, and challenges and opportunities for health commodity procurement. All the sessions indicated the situation where we are and what is the way forward. There were exchange of views, knowledge sharing, and recommendations coming from each session, which we will be drafting in form of a report. And this report of Global Procurement Summit 2021 will be shared with all the stakeholders. Also, the presentations and the photographs will be uploaded on Procurement Knowledge Portal, which is developed and hosted by IMA with support of World Bank, that is indiaprocurement.in. Indiaprocurement.in is the portal which endeavors to be a single window repository on regulatory framework of procurement at central and state level. It also covers the operational data and analytics on procurement in India. It's also a resource center for practitioners, professionals, researchers, academicians, and all related procurement stakeholders. We would recommend all the delegates to be well connected with IMA and be part of IMA family by enrolling for different capacity development programs which are organized by IMA in the area of procurement and contract management. Under the short-term program, IMA offers professional diploma in public procurement, certificate program in contractual dispute resolution, certificate program in public-private partnership, and under the long-term program, we have PGDM executive program in the specialization procurement and contract management. This is AICT approved program and offered with technical support of World Bank. Well, moving towards the end of the summit, I would like to place on record a hearty thanks to Department of Expenditure, Ministry of Finance, Government of India for supporting this summit. I also extend my thanks to the whole team of World Bank under the guidance and leadership of Dr. Junaid and Mr. Shankarlal. We are also grateful to Mr. Takio Konishi and his team from Asian Development Bank for supporting us for the event. We would also like to acknowledge our gratitude to all our partners for associating with us and making this event possible. Many thanks to Deloitte as knowledge partner, GAIL India Limited as PSU partner, and Government e-Marketplace as associate partner for support they have extended to Global Procurement Summit. I also want to state that we are grateful to all the speakers joining us virtually and to our learned delegates who have joined us for this event across the globe. Finally, a big thank you to each and every official from All India Management Association for providing endless support right from planning to the execution of the summit. Wish you all good health and hope to meet you all during Global Procurement Summit 2022. Thank you.